Marko Papic is joining us. He's macro and geopolitical expert at BCA Research. Marko, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's a big, big day for us here as we track the Indian markets because of the union budget and what we expect it to do for our economy. But I suppose the bigger factor, and one which is an uncertainty, becomes what comes out of the United States in terms of tariff control, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And, investors sort of fall into two camps right now when it comes to tariffs. One is that tariffs are a tool of negotiating and therefore not something to worry about in the long term. President Trump can impose tariffs of 25% on Canada, can impose 50, 60, but eventually, they come together and they get a resolution. The other view is that actually tariffs are a way to raise revenue for the government over the long term. I think that the truth is somewhere in between. Some of the tariffs really are a tool of negotiating, and they will be removed, and so the market should look through them. But it is also likely that President Trump will increase tariffs across the board in some fashion in order to raise revenue. I don't think that's going to be that much, but I think it's going to be significant enough to cause more volatility in the markets over the next 3 months.
Volatility, certainly the name of the game. The last time we spoke, Marko, you spoke about the dollar and you spoke about the fact that it might just be the last hurrah. And since that point, the dollar has given up a little bit of ground, but it's been active overnight as well because of those tariffs. Where do you see it going, and what are the implications for capital markets outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the dollar action over the last month, since last time we spoke, definitely speaks to my argument that in 2025, it's unlikely that the dollar is going to go up another 3, 5, 6, 7, 8%. So far, so good. However, there's probably still more upside in the very short term, just because, as you've seen over the past 24 hours, the dollar did rally pretty strongly, given the announcement on the tariffs in Canada and Mexico. And obviously, that is going to be a headwind to emerging markets over the next 3 months, including India. But I think that once the clarity on the tariffs has been put in, once President Trump has finally announced those across-the-board tariffs, that's really what we want to see. Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 2.5%? Is it 5%? That will be the last hurrah for the dollar. All this little stuff with individual countries, I wouldn't worry about it because those are discrete negotiations. With Canada, it's really about border security. With China, it's about fentanyl. I'm not too worried about that. It's really that across-the-board tariff. Once that comes in, we want to know where it is.
Got it. Marko, just one thing. I mean, I know it's with Donald Trump at the helm, almost everything is unpredictable. But if you were looking for one certainty over the course of the next 2 months, and I want to ask for more, because 2 months is almost 2 lifetimes in the current scenario of the US presidency. So if you were to look for some certainty in the next 2 months, 3 months, what have you, a particular time period, what would you most want? Because we know that tariffs will be a moving piece. So that is certainly not something that is going to be static. Is there anything that is something that can be banked upon?
Perhaps it's a little bit of a controversial view, but I think that what we can bank on is that President Trump will not deliver the type of a budget, speaking of a day of budgets, so let's stick with that theme. I don't think he's going to deliver the type of a fiscal expansion that investors think that he can do. Now, on one hand, you might say, well, that's disappointing, right? It means less U.S. growth. But there's 2 reasons why that's very positive, particularly for investors in India. Number one, fiscal thrust in the U.S. is not something that Indian investors should welcome because it's actually what buoys the dollar higher. And I think one of the reasons the dollar has been not so responsive to the tariff threats is that investors are starting to realize that the fiscal outlays are not going to be as huge as what President Trump promised during the election. The second thing is bond yields, right? So the bond yields have settled. You've probably noticed that we're at 4.5% for a couple of days and weeks. That's very positive because that will also allow equities to do generally well, not just in the US, but everywhere else in the world. So what I would say is that perhaps we're spending too much time on the tariffs and not enough on the American budget negotiations and process. And there, I think you will have a growth disappointment, but actually that will be relatively positive for financial assets around the world.
Marko, are you tracking emerging markets and India? And, just interesting to know your perspective as we wait to see what this budget unfolds. Important also because it's the first budget of the third term of this government. And you're hoping for it to set the stage for the plan for the next 5 years. But any thoughts there?
I think what's really important is the FDI attraction. I think that's the most important part of anything that India can do. I think India has generally outperformed expectations in terms of financial markets. Stocks are crushing it. On the other hand, I think that India has, from a macroeconomic perspective, disappointed, actually. I mean, it's not just that growth is coming down, as you mentioned in the early part of the program. It's also that exports have not really done as well as people would have thought. So what India really needs to do is attract FDI. They can lead to more exports and more competitiveness. And I think that that's really where it's not so much the budget, it's more the foreign policy and geopolitics that I think will really matter for India. India has to continue to find a way to kind of navigate all these different blocks. It's done really, really well thus far. And I think that's going to be very important going forward. So like, for example, border negotiations with China, in my view, are probably the most important thing for Indian development going forward, because it's really Chinese industry that can move to India. It's not so much American. That's not where India is going to find alpha generation, if you will, going forward.
Interesting. Marko, thanks as always for taking the time. Pleasure speaking with you. Interesting insight to take from the global stage as well.